It was June of 2022, and the venue for the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC. The venue was packed. Hundreds of far-right politicians and activists gathered to claim election fraud, to launch attacks against the press. Donald Trump was one of the main speakers. He was slated to give a talk on Chinese election interference. Jason Miller was there, Trump's senior campaign advisor, and now the CEO of the conservative Twitter clone Getter. Also in attendance was Republican Mark Green, a far-right congressman who voted against the certification of Joe Biden as president. In a lot of ways, this was just another CPAC conference. The main difference was that this one was happening in Brazil, months before that country's presidential election. And all the false claims about election fraud, they were dubbed in Portuguese. This is the extent to which the MAGA movement embedded itself in Brazilian politics, a relationship that is now worth revisiting after Brazil this weekend had its own January 6th-style attack fueled precisely by fraudulent claims of a rigged election sown by right-wing politicians. That MAGA connection began back in 2018, when Eduardo Bolsonaro, the son of then-presidential candidate Jair Bolsonaro, reached out to Steve Bannon, Trump's former chief strategist. Bolsonaro needed advice. He wanted to know how Trump had made it to power and how his father could, too. Later that year, when the elder Bolsonaro won the election, he credited that win to Donald Trump and Steve Bannon. In fact, when Bolsonaro made his first trip to the U.S. as president, he met with Steve Bannon before he met with Donald Trump. When those two leaders did eventually meet, Trump and Bolsonaro had lots of glowing things to say about one another. And when he got back to Brazil, Bolsonaro was happy to be called, quote, the Donald Trump of the tropics, the Trump of the tropics. To each his own. The relationship between Bolsonaro land and Trump world, it continued and it grew deeper. A few months after Trump lost the 2020 election, Eduardo Bolsonaro attended a cybersecurity forum organized by Mike Lindell, the MyPillow guy. The forum was supposed to show that the 2020 election was stolen by electronic voting machines. Bolsonaro had his own similar theories. He told Trump World his father had information about how hackers could get into Brazil's electronic voting machines. And claims, with no proof, were quickly shared all over social media, including in Brazil. And after January 6th happened, Eduardo Bolsonaro was quoted as saying in reference to those Capitol rioters, if it were organized, they would have taken the Capitol and made demands. On its face, it sort of seemed like Monday morning quarterbacking for an insurrection. But in practice, January 6th might have actually provided a lesson for the Bolsonaros. Because when Jair Bolsonaro lost the presidential election in October of 2022, he strategized. His son, Eduardo, immediately made trips to the U.S. and met in person with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. This is one of those meetings. It took place in November of 2022 while Bolsonaro was still contesting the results of the elections. There you can see Eduardo Bolsonaro sitting next to election denier Kari Lake. Around that time, he also reportedly met with Jason Miller and with Steve Bannon. The dates here are important because while Bolsonaro's son was in the U.S., back in Brazil, thousands of Bolsonaro supporters were taking to the streets claiming election fraud, holding English language signs that read, quote, Brazil was stolen. And they closed streets and called for the military to intervene. When they were asked about their motives, some of them said they wanted chaos, and chaos is what they got. On Sunday, in a scene that had eerie parallels to our very own January 6th, hundreds of Bolsonaro supporters attacked the center of government in Brazil's capital. As it happened in Washington, rioters broke windows and vandalized historical artifacts. They ransacked offices and common areas. The images are so similar to the ones from the Capitol attack that at times it's hard to tell one from the other. And despite all the damage that has been done to Brazilian democracy, Trump and his allies keep at it. Steve Bannon said yesterday on his podcast that he was, quote, not backing off 1 inch on this thing. This thing being presumably Brazil, or maybe the attempt to destroy democracies around the world. Joining us here in the studio is Guga Chacra, international affairs analyst for Globo TV, which is Brazil's largest television network. Mr. Chacra, thank you for being here. Are we getting anything wrong about the connections that we outlined in that script between Brazil and the far right in American politics?
Thanks for having me, Alex. It was perfect. There would not be Bolsonarism in Brazil if there was not a Trumpism in the United States. There will not be even a Bolsonaro's presidency in Brazil if there was not a Trump's presidency in the United States. Bolsonaro and his sons and his group, they try to replicate in Brazil what Trump did in the United States. They're major fans of Donald Trump. They love Trump. Eduardo Bolsonaro, the son of Bolsonaro, he has even he wore a MAGA hat. So he came to CPAC meetings here. He brought the CPAC to Brazil. So they want to do in Brazil what Trump did here. But the crazy thing is that the invasion of the capital didn't work well. Right. But they tried to do the same thing in Brazil.
They basically, it sounds like they almost looked at it as a workshop for what they wanted to do or what they ended up doing later, which was to have people camped out in front of the Capitol, in front of the official buildings, demanding the justice that Trump, for example, was never able to achieve effectively. I wonder, when we talk about how this movement came to be in Brazil, I think in America, we have a hard time understanding the way we are actively exporting election fraud and election denialism and conspiracy theories. Can you talk a little bit about what Trump and what January 6th meant to Brazil and how that unfolded in your country?
A lot. Because of what Trump did on January 6th, or because of what he did after he lost to Joe Biden, they saw that in Brazil and they wanted to do the same. After that, and even before, but after that, Bolsonaro started to talk about fraud, about the electronic ballots that wouldn't work well, that you couldn't trust them. So he started to put this on the head, on the minds of some of his followers, not all of them. Many of Bolsonaro's voters, they don't believe what Bolsonaro says. They voted for him for different reasons, but on those followers. So it worked in a way because they really think that there was fraud and Lula was not legally elected president, legitimate the elected president of Brazil.
Had people been thinking about the concept of election fraud before it started becoming such a pervasive virus in the United States? Is that something that was talked about in Brazil prior to this?
No, it was not talked about, like almost never. Like always the loser accepted the result. Like Lula lost 3 elections in the past. So, and the vice president of Lula lost to Lula, actually. He was a rival of Lula in the past, Geraldo Alckmin, and they always accepted the results. Because in Brazil it's different than the United States. You can count votes in a few hours. Everybody votes the same way, and it's one person, one vote who has more who wins in the popular vote over the country's elected president. So it's easier than the U.S. So it's harder for Bolsonaro to try to do what Trump did in the U.S.
People, I think, don't recognize the ways in which, well, to begin with, Brazil is a younger democracy than the United States of America. We're always seen as the baby on the international stage, but really it's post-1985 that this democratic Brazil exists because of the history you guys have with autocracy, military rule, top-down management, as it were. Do you think you're in a better position to battle this kind of misinformation, to battle this kind of push towards autocracy?
No, in a way, it's different.
Or is it the opposite?
Like, in some ways, it's better because Brazil is not as polarized in the United States that you have a two-party system. Brazil is a multi-party system. So you saw the response on Monday with Lula and all the governors, the judges, the president of the Senate, of the House, all together and meeting and then running, walking from the presidential palace to the Supreme Court. That in this way is better. But as an institution, the armed forces in the United States is a stronger institution than the armed forces in Brazil.
When we talk about how to quash this, right? It's the misinformation, the disinformation that's coming from the Steve Bannons, the CPACs, the international internet where conspiracy theories flourish. But it also sounds, as it is in the United States, that there are certain funders behind this, right? I did not know this. The people who are encamped outside of the government buildings, outside of the Army headquarters, saying that Bolsonaro won the election, the people who were the acolytes, effectively, of the Steve Bannons and the Bolsonaros, they had, one of them, Mr. Rodriguez, this is according to the New York Times, spent 9 weeks sleeping in a tent on a narrow pad with his wife. When he provided a tour of the encampment, it had become a small village since Bolsonaro had lost the election. It had showers, a laundry service, cell phone charging stations, a hospital, and 28 food stalls. This was not some ad hoc tent village. This sounds like there was funding behind this. What more do you know about the groups that may have been working to actively support Bolsonaro's anti-democratic forces?
So the Brazilian justice is investigating many companies, dozens of companies. We know that some of them, they're linked to the agribusiness in Brazil, but not only to the agribusiness, to other sectors of the Brazilian economy as well. And we can't generalize the agribusiness, like some groups in the agribusiness would be financing, but they're still beginning this investigation, and we will know soon who was behind that, because there were people behind that for sure.
Can you just explain agribusiness when you talk about that? Is that largely the business that is intent on further developing Brazil, parts of the Amazon, to cattle ranching? Is that who we're talking about? Is that part of that?
It's really strong in Brazil, in different parts of Brazil. Brazil is the size of continental United States, so it's different, the agribusiness in the region of the Amazon when you compare to the agribusiness in the São Paulo state that's much more developed. So it depends a lot where we are talking about, but it's a huge sector in Brazil and one of the most developed sector in the Brazilian economy for sure.
Well, I know that Lula, the actually democratically elected leader, has mentioned agribusiness. They're very intent on finding out who is financing this push towards autocratic, anti-democratic forces. We will be following the story there as we follow it here. It's so nice to have you on set. Thank you for your reporting. Thank you for time.